PJNet Live, Wednesday night, February 26th. It's a little after 9 o'clock here on the East Coast. It's time to get started. We have Stephanie waiting for us in the green room. We have titles rolling, and we have a chat room waiting. So let's switch to Studio 6 in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, good evening. Welcome to PJNet.TV. I'm still trying to get used to that because we used to call it something else. And it used to be, anyway. So it is going so well. I appreciate all of you who are here checking on us tonight. We have two special guests lined up for you, both of which have been here before, but not that much. So standing by in our green room is a foremost expert on all things Hebrew, Jewish, and all that kind of stuff. Stephanie Pavlantos. How'd I do? No, just
That's
short.
Right.
Not too. It's kind of like Prasic, you know. But you were with us, what, I guess a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, and we talked about a lot of things. But the thing that you are most passionate about, we didn't get to. So we thought we'd just follow up. Because you have kind of, I don't know what got you started on it, but you've gone on this journey to explore the Judeo, we say Judeo-Christian. You're saying the roots are very much Jewish. It is the Jewish faith and tradition that gave birth to the modern day Christianity, and we owe it. It would be good to know our roots. So, Stephanie, I have some coffee here. And I am anxious to hear. I'm anxious to drink the coffee. So
Good. Well, thank you for having me and letting me talk about this thing that I love so much. And I think that every once in a while, we think that Christianity is American or English. It's like it started and Jesus was a Christian man, and I think it's just easy to get in that mode because of how we're taught and how the churches and just everything. We really get caught up in the New Testament and even like different this version, that version, and everything of the Bible. But the Bible was 90% of the Bible was written in Hebrew. And everyone who wrote it was a Jewish man. And so there's a lot of Jewishness to our faith, to our understanding of the Bible, and even the Hebrew idiom. Sometimes we read and it's like, what does that even mean? And here it's a Hebrew idiom. It's like when Jesus spoke and when the others spoke, it would be like telling somebody in Iran, don't count your chickens before they hatch. And they look at you like, what does that even mean? And that's kind of what we experience sometimes when we read the Bible. And so I think it's really cool to find out what different things mean. Where are those idioms and what did they mean by them? And when Jesus told the parables, well, what did he mean by all these things? And why did people understand them? Did they not understand them? We just have so many preconceived ideas and even things that we've been taught for so many years that some people challenge, and they are kind of right in challenging some of those beliefs and those traditions. So that's what I want to talk about.
Well, and not only do you like to talk about it, you actually teach on this subject with some regularity, It looks like.
Yes.
You've made quite a brand for yourself just teaching our historic roots.
Mm-hmm. So I just wrote a Bible study on the book of Hebrews, and in it I talk a lot about the Hebrew language and Hebrew culture, because the book of Hebrews, even though it's in the New Testament, it deals a lot with the Old Testament. It deals a lot with Exodus, Leviticus, the Torah, as we call it. It deals a lot with the Psalms and the writings and everything like that. And so when you start bringing in those books, and we already know those are Hebrew scriptures, and you bring them into the New Testament, people look at it like, oh no, I'm not going to get this. And it's not like that at all, because when you start putting them together, God doesn't do anything halfway. When he put together the New Testament, you have the Old. You can't have one without the other. You can't have day without night. And he made everything to go together, and he made his covenant to go to that together too. And actually, the Bible would be more, we would be more accurate in calling it the Old Covenant and the renewed covenant, because actually a testament can be changed, but a covenant does not change. It just gets renewed. And so the New Testament doesn't change the Old Testament, as we call it, but it renews. And when Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, he didn't come to do those things. He came to fulfill the law, and that word means interpret. He came to interpret the law for us so that we would understand it more clearly, and that his own people would understand it more clearly. So that was his purpose in teaching us what he did. And Jesus was a rabbi. We think he may have even, some people might think he's was just a man. I mean, of course, he's the Son of God, and he knew everything, but in his human form, he was a well-educated rabbi. And they called him rabbi because he had disciples. He taught people things, and people wanted to be around him because he was popular, in the sense that people loved to hear him teach. But he was a very educated human when he was on this earth.
Well, and back in those days, they didn't have credentials like today. I wonder how many of those biblical
Yes.
heroes could even find a job in modern day religion.
Right. And they even, like, we have things written in the Bible about, what good ever came out of Nazareth, or those Galileans, they're not so with it, they're not so smart, but that wasn't true at all. The Galileans actually, from something I read, the Galileans actually had a very good education, and they learned early on to memorize. They started at 5 years old, like we start our children, but they started learning the Torah at that age. They started memorizing throughout their life, because not everyone had scrolls. They didn't carry them around like we carry around a Bible, so they memorized everything. And they did a good job. I mean, there are rabbis that they know the whole Torah. They can just recite it from memory. And they were doing it back in Jesus' time too. So,
Interesting.
so let me share with you a few things. So, something in John, we read all the time about that when it says that in 1 John that when Jesus came to the earth, and it talks about him being the flesh, the Word made flesh, and it talks how his people did not accept him. And that actually does not mean his people as in all Hebrews or all of Israel. It actually means his tribe. His tribe did not accept him, and those were the Judeans. And a little interesting note, and some may know and some that, but one of the things I have heard is that when, where did we get the word Jew? Well, it was from a particular group, a tribe of Judeans, and so they shortened Judeans into Jew, and so that's where that kind of came about. And so there are people who said, well, only the Jews are those from the tribe of Judah, but not all of them. But we kind of used that across the board. But they were all Hebrews. They were all part of different tribes. But the tribe that rejected Jesus was most often his own. Because we read even another group of people who get a really bad rap are Pharisees. Pharisees were actually people who believed most like Jesus did. And Jesus was hard on them because just like we have in our day and time in our churches, there are a few hypocrites that kind of linger around and cause trouble, and Jesus was hard on them because he didn't want them to be that way. The Sadducees didn't believe in some of the same things that we would call biblical, like a resurrection, an eternal place to live. But Pharisees believed very closely to the same ways that Jesus taught. And as a result, he held them accountable for the things that they did and the way they acted when they were out of line. But you see that he doesn't often refer to the Sadducees or some of the others. And so it's just, when we see him act a certain way, we wonder why, and we think that they must have just all been bad, but they weren't. And in Acts, we can go into Acts, especially Acts 15 and some of the other chapters, and find where there were groups of Jewish people, Pharisees in particular, who followed the way, as they called it. And that's the other thing, we kind of funny, because Christianity came from Judaism. It was never intended to be two separate religions, and but because one group rejected it and they stayed to their own ways, then the other group kind of went and became the way, and that's how they were known early on in the Bible. Another group of people who followed the Messiah and recognized him as Jesus as the Messiah was the priest. When Luke writes in his gospel as well as Acts, he writes to a particular man. He dedicates it to Theophilus. And there was a Theophilus in history who lived and was actually the high priest of the temple from 36 AD to 41. And so Luke, in order to write this man these letters that we call the books of the Bible, but in Luke and Acts, he had to be a Jewish man. He had to have written the language and understood, because a Gentile man, like we often think of Luke, would not have been able to write a letter like that to a high priest and have the high priest read it or care about it. So as a result, Luke was probably a Jewish man who was probably one of the 72 disciples. So, and he wrote this story about why the priests were going and turning and following the Messiah instead of what they had been taught, or as far as thinking that Jesus was the Messiah. So it was interesting because of that. But that's what the whole letters were to this man. But that's those are a couple things that we don't often know in Scripture and don't often know the background of. And so I think that's interesting. But there's many more things about the language. Hebrew is it has three parts to its language. So it has the alphabet like we have. The first letter is Aleph. And the second letter is Bet, and that's where we get our word, alphabet. And then it also has a pictographic language, which is kind of like what we would see in Egypt. And then it also has a numerical value. So for instance, when we look at the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the letter Aleph, which is kind of shaped like a diagonal line, and then it has two dots on either side of it, or two small lines, and they're called yods because they're just kind of like a comma. And when you put those three together, they don't touch necessarily, but they're three parts of one letter, and their number is one, like the Trinity. And as a result, that first letter of the Hebrew alphabet actually stands for the Father. It stands for a leader, or it actually is a picture of an ox, but it stands for a strong leader, or the one who is above all. And the interesting thing about that is when Jesus said, I am the Alpha and the Omega, he actually said that in Hebrew. And he would have said, I am the Aleph and the Tav. And the Tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it used to be shaped like a cross. So when you take that pictographic language and now you put it into what it means in words, it basically means what he was saying is, I am the one on the cross.
Hmm.
And that was what he was saying when he said what we now call the Alpha and the Omega. And so those kinds of things just get me excited, because I think they're really cool, and how the richness and the depth to the language and what it adds to scripture even.
Well, it's interesting, but I think it's more of a lost art today than it would have been before the advent of smartphones, where uh, concise, and we were having this conversation before we went on the air, concise communication isn't really emphasized anymore. As long as you are understood, and when you, and this is dangerous, okay, because one only need to recall the account of the story of Babel. It's hard to get things done when everybody's not on the
Yes.
same page. I know this as a coach, so it's good that we should study some of the linguistic origins, and I like studying Latin. Is my favorite. Basically, if you can learn Latin, you've got a pretty good insight into most
Right.
every other language. I mean, you can kind of, connect a few dots here and there. What is your opinion about language, the decay of concise language?
Oh, wow. Um, well, I think, as a writer and as a teacher, we I think one of the things that you hear as a writer, it's always write tight and be concise, and don't use too many words. I have a friend who will be like, "You're the amplified version," and this person's the King James version. When we write and when we talk, and but as far as concise language, I think we lose out on so much. And even what you were saying about the Latin. I mean, my husband loves Latin as well, and Greek, and he feels like he can learn any word in the dictionary as long as he understands and knows the Latin roots or the Greek roots of it, and he can put words together
Mm-hmm.
and sound them out phonetically, and usually say a word that he's never seen before, and sound it out phonetically and say it. And I think that we have lost that. We don't. We shorten things. We, even texting really created bad habits, and just we learn the language as it was. I know a friend who she carries around this huge dictionary, and what, oh my goodness, it's like one of the very first Webster's dictionaries, or Noah Webster, and she will look up any word to find its meaning, and we have lost so many of these rich words that we used to use in language and in writing and in communication throughout the years. I
Well, I
think we get.
enjoy language studies because,
Mhm.
and we got to wrap it up here. But theologically, I believe and firmly that the Bible is inerrant, and
Right.
if there is any error in the Bible, then the whole thing's no good. Okay, it's
Mhm.
just another story, another fantasy. However, uh, God spoke. God's trying to reveal Himself, but we're using language, and language is
Right.
very imperfect. For example, in this culture, we toss around the word love in so many
Right.
ways.
Right.
I love chocolate. I love my dog. I love my wife. Well,
Hmm.
folks,
Right.
that's a pretty catch. That's a broad brush to paint with when you start throwing this word love around.
Right.
In
When
some
you
of the
look at it
Indian languages, they didn't even have a word for love. They would express friendship or intimacy by saying things like, "Well, you'd make a good fishing partner."
together.
Yeah, they just didn't have a word for love. And of
Right.
course, we know, we have agape, phileo, and eros in the Greek language that
Yeah.
refines or is more concise in what context Is it so? I think it's useful because we communicate, and Jesus did a good job, I think, of telling stories because stories kind of transcend the words.
Yes.
You get the
Yes.
point of the story where the words themselves. I grew up with Aesop's fables. That's how old I am. That's
Right.
good stuff. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, closing remarks. We've got another guest coming here in a moment, but Stephanie, my mind is kind of blown here in the chat room.
Sorry.
Becky Lindsay was saying, "Hey, wow, this is so interesting," says Becky
Oh,
Lindsay in
great.
our chat room.
Hi, Becky.
And I love coffee. That resonated with Becky too. Anyway, so anyway, wrap it up in about a minute because I got to go. But thanks for sharing with us, Stephanie.
Thank you.
I know that this is a passion, and apparently there's an appetite for it because you're in demand.
Good.
We didn't have to pay you.
I know. Just give me a place to speak and talk, and I'll talk and talk. So, thank you.
All right, Stephanie, thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate your insights and keep going and keep the good words flowing, okay?
Thank you.
All right. All right, folks, that is just the beginning of more to come because, hey, that's the Golden Gate Bridge. The Eagle's Nest has gone across the country from Florida to California, and there you see the Golden Gate Bridge as if we're actually there. Folks, we're going to have to kind of lay low here for a minute. We'll be back at the bottom of the hour. And Michelle has just arrived back in town. She's not going to make it tonight, but she has Ashley, who's been here before, coming to share with us. So before I leave, I'm going to ask you 2 questions that you don't have to answer me about, but I hope you ask yourself. These 2 very important questions that get to the very meaning of our existence. Number 1, what is the single boldest thing you have ever done for Jesus Christ? Now, if you're kind of proud of that, let's answer question number 2. How long ago was that? Folks, let's not ever let ourselves be satisfied with either answer.